The Bible is a collection of texts that are thousands of years old. 21st century Western society is radically different from the culture the biblical texts emerge from. And the biblical authors just sort of assume that you know certain things. Today, we are going to talk about 10 things the Bible just assumes that you know, but they don't explain on this episode of Ancient Egypt and the Bible. Okay, today we're going to discuss 10 things the Bible doesn't really explain to you. Basically, the biblical authors knew all this stuff, and their initial audiences knew everything that we're going to be talking about here. But because they have this knowledge implicitly in their society, they don't bother talking about the specifics of these in the text. So what we're going to do is just outline 10 things, and this is not by any means a complete list, all right? There's actually a lot more than 10, but we're just going to sort of restrict it to 10 just for the sake of brevity. And each of these 10 items are things that, because they lived in the land of Canaan, they just knew about it, okay? And they grew up in a specific culture. They knew certain things that they just took for granted and didn't think they needed to explain. So we're going to go step by step through these 10 items and just talk about each one really, really briefly. We won't go into any great detail here. Just sort of say, just to give you a heads up that goes, when you encounter something, oh, maybe I should look into this a little deeper because they're assuming things that we don't necessarily assume. All right. Now, the first item is geography. The Bible does not explain the geography of the Holy Land to you. The writers assume that you know and understand the culture of geography, right? Now, when we talk about the culture of geography, we are talking about how they sort of viewed the world in a pre-compass society. So the Israelites did not have the magnetic compass. And they didn't go by compass coordinates, north, south, east, and west. They didn't do that. But they did have a sense of geographic placement. For example, north, that's Turkey, that's in Hatti. South is Egypt. East is Mesopotamia, even though that's kind of more northeast. And the sea is the other cardinal direction, and they call this the land of the Philistines. So if you ever encounter sea or land of the Philistines, they mean west, right? Now, they just expect you to know that there was also a swamp that ran down the entire country, basically separating the coastal plain from the Judean foothills, and particularly the Shephelah Valley. So the swamp was, as you went from the Mediterranean Sea into the coastal plain, you then encountered the swamp, and then on the other side of the swamp was the first set of hills of the western portion of the Shephelah Valley. Okay? So they just expect that you know about this swamp. They don't talk about this swamp. I don't think there's even a single passage in the Bible that talks about the swamp or what lived in the swamp, because that swamp was infested by hippopotamuses. Hippopotami? Something like that. Okay, but they just expect you to know this. All right? They just expect you to know that there was this huge swamp dividing the land of Canaan in half, essentially, in a north-south direction. So, again, it's one of those things everybody in the ancient in Canaan just knew, but they didn't explain it to you. And actually, that swamp survived until the 1940s. It was the Israelis, after they took over the land, that drained that swamp. So that swamp doesn't exist today, but it pretty much lasted until the last century. So again, it's just something they expect you to know. This whole idea of geography. They expect you to know what cities are north of what cities. They expect you to know where the Jezreel Valley is. They just expect you to have an intuitive understanding of geography. Second thing is crafts and technology. The biblical writers don't generally explain how crafts and technology work. Things such as metalsmithing, pottery, basket making, cooking, making clothes and sandals, and the improvised equipment that goes along with those crafts. The Bible just expects you to know, when it talks about iron chariots, that the entire chariot was not made of iron, only the critical components like the axle assembly. They also expect you to know how a chariot works and how a wheel in the ancient world was made and it was put together and worked. It was actually the wheel comes out of bow making, like in like composite bow technology. They just expect you to know how a composite bow was made, and thus they expect you to know how wheels were made. So again, they just expect you to know this stuff. They expect you to know that chariots were mostly leather. They also expect you to know that sandals were made of leather and tunics were made of wool. Again, these are things they sometimes women, but these are things that they just expect you to understand. So the whole idea of crafts and craftsmanship is a thing that the Israelite authors just knew intuitively because it was part of their daily lives. They didn't need to explain it because just everybody knew it. The third thing they expect you to know is agriculture. Yeah, today most of us are not raised on farms, but back then, just about everybody had some experience with farming life and agriculture. So the Bible assumes that you know a bit about agriculture. They expect you to know that sheep are not killed for wool. I really wish I didn't have to mention that, but I have had skeptics mention that, asking where did the Israelites get wool to make clothing in the wilderness? And it's like, you did know they had sheep, right? Yeah, but what do they do after they killed the sheep for the wool? You don't kill sheep for wool. You shear sheep for wool. Hmm? Yeah, much to the sheep's relief. Yeah, exactly. But seriously, we get people today who have no connection to agriculture, and thus they don't know that wool is sheared without harming the animal. These are things that the writers in ancient Israel, and ancient Israel was a pastoralist society. They primarily ate sheep and goats, and they tended flocks. And the biblical writers just expect you to know how animals were raised, how they were, how their products were harvested, and how they were slaughtered. They just expected you to know this. So again, it's one of those things where you are not told explicitly by the Bible, but they expect you to know it. Okay, the fourth thing that the Bible expects you to know is the birds and the bees. Yes, the Bible assumes you know about sex, the birds and the bees. They expect you to know where babies come from and that sex is enjoyable. The Bible will teach you about what happens when sex is done outside of a marital union. But the biblical writers expect you to know the obvious, which is that sex is supposed to be inside of marriage and is inherently good and holy. And the biblical writers expect you to know how that works mechanically. Okay? They're not going to explain it to you. They're not going to hold your hand. They just expect you to know this, or at least learn this from your parents, or wherever you did learn it from. The next thing that the Bible just expects you to know is the structure and function of clans and tribes. The clan was the most important family unit mentioned in the Bible. The clan is considered to be more important than even the tribe. Okay, all the power in ancient Israelite society is concentrated with the clan. Now, a clan is a family unit that extends back at least 4 generations. It can go a lot longer, but 4 living generations. Okay. And we have done an entire video on clans, so you can see that if you're unclear as to what a clan is. But society in ancient Israel was organized around clans. Yes, they got their territory by tribe, but within that tribal allocation of land, each portion was divided according to the clans. So the clan structure is the most important structure in the Bible, and it's talked about so frequently, but they don't define it, and they expect you to understand this. And they expect you to understand what this means for a lot of passages. In fact, Israelite culture is obsessed with clans. They're absolutely obsessed with it. And if you don't understand how that works, some of portions of the Bible can seem quite confusing, because a lot of it boils down to clan politics, retribution of clan vendettas, and even how inheritance works. Okay, so it's really, really an important understanding, but it's an understanding that the biblical writers just intuitively knew because they were living this. Okay? So that leads us to our 6th thing the Bible expects you to understand. Just know. Child revenge. This is closely related to clans as clan warfare. Clan retribution is vicious and unforgiving, and it is within that rubric of clan warfare that we find child revenge. Kill a child's parents, and any male child that survives is obligated to avenge his parents. And almost all clan systems seem to obey this principle. And the Bible just expects you to know this. Wipe out all the parents in Jericho, and the children will be obligated to seek revenge for their killed parents. This is just how clan warfare and clan retribution works. And child revenge is the norm in clan societies, not the exception. And the Old Testament writers, the biblical writers, just expect you to know this. The 7th thing that the Bible expects you to know is descriptive law, or what's sometimes called case law. Law in the Old Testament is case law. It is law that has been defined by secular powers for specific rulings. It was not legislative fiat most of the time. Most crimes in ancient Israel could be bargained out of with the monetary fine. And the rulings that are prescribed in the Bible are in many ways seen as sort of maximal outcomes. Moreover, many of the laws of ancient Israel were compatibilized to existing normative practice in the Levant. So it's a way that the ancient writers reconciled what was normative with how to regulate that within the theocratic system of Israel. And they just sort of expected you to know this. They expect you to know that the law is case law. They expect you to know that it is not always the ideal in many ways. Like, for example, in the case of divorce. Divorce happened. It happened before the Bible, and it happened after the Bible. So it was a way to compatibilize the laws for divorce were a way to compatibilize the existing normative practice with a regulated practice under the religious system of ancient Israel. Number 8, analogical language. The Bible is full of analogical language. What that is when you take the things of daily life and try to incorporate them into the drama of the gods so you understand what's happening. For example, Genesis 7:11 talks about the windows of heaven opening up and the flood rains coming. Okay? Now, the Bible here is not suggesting that there were real windows up in the sky with shutters and panes and all that. It's an image of something that they were familiar with to explain something they were not familiar with. And analogy is used in many aspects of biblical thought, such as the whole idea of cosmology. This idea that you had a world that was sitting on the pillars of the earth, and underneath the earth was the sea, and underneath the sea was Sheol. Okay? It's a way of analogizing how they particularly viewed the afterlife. So, analogical thought cannot and should not be taken literally. It is one culture relating what they don't know to what they can relate to. And the Bible expects you to be able to understand that when it uses this kind of language. Number 9, Omens and Magic. The biblical writers assume you know about everyday magic. This is magical practice that would have been common among average people. Things such as omens, execration magic, and curse spells are something that practically every Israelite would have known about and may have even encountered from time to time. For example, the sun standing still in the sky in Joshua chapter 10. That's an omen. That's not the sun physically stopping in the sky. It's a particular arrangement of astronomical bodies that has an omen or a portent of misfortune to come. And the Israelites understood this. Most of the cultures of the ancient Near East understood this. And it was very, very just commonly understood. And while we don't do this today, we don't do things such as omens and execration magic and curse spells. It was something that was common to the people of the late Bronze Age. And the biblical writers just expect you to know this. And finally, number 10, basic literacy. The Lachish Ostraka has made it clear that those who had not achieved basic literacy within the military hierarchy of ancient Israel were a source of derision. Now, the Bible usually does not talk about this. The biblical writers assume that you can read and understand language that is sort of placed in front of you. And this includes just not only a basic understanding of, say what the Bible says, but also the biblical writer expects you to understand the literary devices that those writers use. Things such as repetition, simile, metaphor, metonymy, alliteration, amphibole, and poetics. Okay? And poetics has a whole secondary set of literary devices that are associated with it. And the biblical writer just assumes you understand this vast swath of literary devices as they write. So they're not going to say, oh, well, this is a repetition meant to amplify what I'm saying. They're just going to do the repetition to amplify what they say. They're not going to hold your hand. Okay? They don't hold your hand for literary devices. They just expect you to understand and know it. And basic literacy is part and parcel to understanding the text. And again, in ancient Israelite thought, if you didn't have that basic literacy, they sometimes mocked you because they just assumed you should know this. And unfortunately, a lot of people approach the biblical text as a text sort of devoid of all that stuff that we would, say, learn in an English class. So it's very, very important for you as the reader to understand that the writer of the text assumes that you have that basic literacy and knowledge of literary devices under your belt. Okay? So that's the 10th and final item we're going to be talking about today. So there you have it. 10 things that the biblical writers just expect you to know and understand intuitively without them explaining it to you. We hope you found that helpful. We hope you learned something. Thank you very much for watching, and we'll see you next time on Ancient Egypt and the Bible.